Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Mystery Philosophy Theater 9000. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Today the film we'll be looking at is Captain America: Civil War, with a clip that breaks new ground for the Avengers series in the form of philosophical reflection. While audiences watch Marvel movies for the rollicking action and depth of intertwined stories, Civil War adds a new dimension by forcing the Avengers to examine the consequences of their actions. If you'd like to watch the video of this episode, I'll post it on my YouTube and link to it in the show notes. And if you'd rather listen, then just sit back and enjoy. Alright, so we're our second installment of our video podcast. We're looking at Captain America: Civil War. To set the scene a little bit, when we jump into it, we're going to flash to a different clip where there's already some discussion going on, so I didn't want to miss the beginning of that. But basically, the movie starts in typical Marvel fashion. There's a bad guy. He's hatching a plan. The Avengers are, chasing him in car chases through the city. There's gunfights. There's explosions. The whole works. It's 21st century Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote stuff. And this is, up to this point in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that's nothing anybody would bat an eye at, right? That's pretty atypical for the start of a movie. And people love it. The special effects are great, and seeing them get to work is awesome. But as the movie goes on, something different happens from the other films where, after that first action scene where the building gets blown up, the whole works.
Inadvertently, something that
right.
They hadn't intended to happen.
Right.
This is the way you find out, just because you're intending to do good, it doesn't necessarily happen.
Yes.
And that it begins with that. That's really cool.
Right, exactly. So, in neutralizing the bad guys, there's a lot of collateral damage. And the world governments come to them and say, listen, guys, this is like the fourth or fifth time you've leveled a city trying to save the world. Like, you can't be doing that anymore. So we want you to have some sort of oversight. Here's these Sokovia Accords. We want to have some say in the actions that you're taking before you take them and end up, killing innocent people or destroying major infrastructure, that sort of thing. And so what happens is the Avengers, in seeing this accord, they're divided about it. Some of them say, hey, you know what? It might be a good idea to have some oversight. Some of them think, no, that if we put our fate in somebody else's hands, it can only lead to disaster. So that's sort of the background, and we'll jump into the scene.
Yeah.
Just as soon as I find where I put the remote. Okay.
Secretary Ross has a Congressional Medal of Honor, which is one more than you have.
So let's say we agree to this thing. How long is it going to be before they LoJack us like a bunch of common criminals?
117 countries want to sign this. 117, Sam, and you're just like, no, it's cool, we got
How
it.
long are you going to play both sides?
I have an equation.
So right off the bat, Colonel Rhodes and Sam are arguing. And what they're arguing about is sort of distrust in letting the government control their actions. Which is interesting, right? Because both of these guys are African-American men who are in the military.
Yes.
And so I think that a lot of times in real life, right, we see this sort of, I think there's this temptation to
assume that one group of people believes exactly the same.
Right. And especially a group like the military where, okay, everybody's wearing the same uniform. Everybody's gone through a lot of the same things. So they're automatons, right? You're like, okay, every military person is a blue collar, conservative, all these different
right.
whatever attributes you want to give them. And the fact is, from being in the military, I know that that's not true. And especially when you have people here, a lot of people might not be familiar with military ranks, but Rhodes is a colonel. That's a very high rank. It's a rank where he probably has a master's degree. You know, his background in life has probably taken a much different path from Sam's as we've looked at the Falcon and the Winter Soldier and these sorts of things,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
So, despite the similarities in the characters, their backgrounds and their thought processes on things are obviously quite different.
And as I, we've noticed this, but we have a triumvirate here. We have a triangle of three military guys. The only, I think I'm accurate in saying this for the Avengers at this point, the only three military people in the organization. So Captain America from a different era, but he was answering to the government from the very start. He volunteered to be a super soldier for the United States military,
Right.
and the Allies, and he's the one sitting and reading through this tome, this thick volume of Accords, and Stark is sitting on the couch holding his poor head, having a headache, rolling his eyes like the spoiled child he always is. Steve is reading the thing, and the other guys are debating, but they're three military people, but they don't even, all three of them don't have exactly the same ideas.
Right. Yeah, and that's an interesting thing to point out, right? Is you see Steve reading through the Accords, and you can see how thick the thing is, and so you know that doesn't just have two sentences saying, the world governments want to manage the Avengers. No, like there's a lot that's in this, and we know this from modern legislation in real life, right? There's no any sort of legislation encompasses a large number of changes.
Right.
And it raises the question, how many of these Avengers have read the Accords? How much of it have they read? How much of it do they understand?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because just because they're Avengers doesn't mean they're all brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, like
Stark is scientifically brilliant and it doesn't, they're smart people, but they're not necessarily going to, like any group of us, it takes a lot of people with a lot of viewpoints to try to figure something out, and we can't default to, oh well, they're super in every way, because not necessarily.
Right, and there's a difference between reading a scientific white paper and a piece of legislation, right?
Exactly.
And so yeah, it's interesting because if you think about it, there's a good chance Captain America here only has a high school education, whereas Colonel Rhodes probably has a master's degree in something,
Yeah.
and has been involved in politics his whole life and these sorts of things. So yeah, who would be qualified to actually interpret this document?
Plus, we think about, if we put it other, you just gave me another thought. If we think about the storyline, Captain America, he was frozen. He was awakened. Nick Fury telling him things. But by this storyline here, maybe he's a year out from having awakened. So as far as he knew, World War II ended a year ago, even though it ended decades and decades ago. So the character can't help it. He's trying to catch up. But all of that mindset has got to be in there too.
Yeah. From his point of view, it's like
he could be grandfather or great grandfather to these guys.
Yeah. It's a fascinating perspective. All right.
Oh, this will clear it up.
In the 8 years since Mr. Stark announced himself as Iron Man, the number of known enhanced persons has grown exponentially. And during the same period, the number of potentially world-ending events has risen at a commensurate rate.
He's saying it's our fault?
I'm saying there may be a causality. Our very strength invites challenge. Challenge incites conflict. And conflict breeds catastrophe. Oversight. Oversight is not an idea that can be dismissed out of hand.
Boom.
So Vision comes in and he almost has sort of Socratic dialogue, right?
He does.
Says, so, what happens when there's power? What happens when there's this? What happens when there's a catastrophe? And there's this sort of causal chain, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's taking this logical approach to saying, we've been operating under this paradigm that there's been bad guys out there and that superheroes have arisen to protect the world. Yeah. But what if the paradigm is actually that superheroes arose and then that bad people arose to challenge that power and to attempt to establish their own autonomy over world events.
Yeah, it's exactly it. It is Socratic. It is suggestive of a causality. And Vision's not saying that's 100% absolute. He's saying, but we need to think about this.
Yeah, and essentially what he's opening up for sort of the first time the idea that maybe this group of superhuman people have biases that are creating a blind spot in their decision-making process.
Yeah.
And that's a very powerful statement, and something that's been examined in a lot of pop culture recently. There's a ton of TV shows and movies out there about, well, what happens if superheroes were bad?
Yes.
Or what happens in these sorts of things. And it's a powerful paradigm, and it's also interesting to consider.
It is.
And so in Vision's sort of view, what he's saying is that Pandora's box is already opened, right? So Pandora's box, Pandora opens this thing, evil escapes into the world. You can't put the evil back.
The only thing that is still available is hope.
Right, yeah.
With Pandora. So yeah, and again, he's asserting a kind of calmness that he's not seeing in his colleagues, but he's a synthesoid. He has an android mind, and so we're drawing on the strength of that. So you essentially have partial technology talking to people who have, in some way or other, some of them, not all of them, been enhanced by technology, and who have made choices that have led to technological destructiveness. So there's a whole tech thing going on in here that's unspoken. But Stark with his armor, and Sam with his his Falcon wings, and Rhodey with his Iron Man armor that he took and the government modified to make what's the name of the character?
War Machine.
War Machine, and the Scarlet Witch is certainly supernatural, so we're not going to say technological with that, but Black Widow, extremely well trained gymnastically and in fighting and so on. We saw a lot of that in her movie later on, but she still has technology to zap people.
Yeah, and I think the technology part of it, that is kind of the evil in Pandora's box almost, right? So, because what happened is Vision's saying, once Stark made the armor, right? Once that technology got out of the box, and then you had the first Avengers movie happen in New York City, and you started seeing these aliens with advanced technology coming from space, right? Vision's sort of viewpoint is, listen, now that these people know we have this power, and they know where we are, they're going to keep coming, right? And we need to have some sort of plan. Somebody has to have some sort of plan of what we're going to do the next time it happens. And that's when he says, that's why oversight's a good thing, right? Because we need to have a plan. We need to have somebody who's thinking about these things ahead of time, rather than us as a group just being reactionary to whatever is going on.
Yes, that's the crux of it.
Tony, you're being uncharacteristically non-hyperverbal.
It's because he's already made up his mind. Oh, you know me so well.
So now what we're seeing is dissonance within the group, right? So Rhodey and Sam, they were having a heated debate, but they were discussing the merits of these sort of ideals. What we're seeing here is Natasha attempting to draw Tony in with sort of a bit of a personal jab, and Captain America just automatically assuming that Tony has made up his mind that he's going to be on the opposing side, and Tony sarcastically acknowledging Steve's viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about that, right, is that Tony and Captain America, these guys are the leaders of the two separate sides in the Civil War movement. But both of them, especially as we'll see as the discussion progresses, both of them appear to have their minds made up already at this point.
Yes, they seemingly do. They are, if not polar opposition, extreme opposition to each other, with a very strong, one might say, strident position.
Right. And what's interesting about that is we see their followers actually debating the merits of each side and suggesting compromises and these sorts of things. But the two leaders are standing their ground with what they believe. And that sort of is a reflection of politics in real life, right? You see politicians and they'll take a stand for something. And very rarely do you see a politician, say, well, this idea also has merits, so we'll try to compromise and incorporate the ideas of it. At least not in modern times. It's not something you see very often. But regular people on the streets like you and I, that's what you do. If you walk into a coffee shop or a grocery store or something, you'll hear people talking about these ideas. And, lots of times if a good discussion's happening, they're talking about the merits of them or the dismerits or where things should be compromised or their own ideas of what might be a better alternative.
And I would hope that happens. I haven't seen that happen as much lately as I would like to see it happen. But that is going to be the place where it does happen. It has to happen in the coffee shops and old guys and gals having coffee in a local deli or what have you. I met a new doctor yesterday. I started to practice with this new doctor, young woman, very interesting philosophically. She's going to listen to the podcast. And she insists that you need to have all the data about your patient and listen to your patient and talk. So she took an hour to talk to me. I've never had a doctor take an hour to talk to me about just to get to know you, right? But that's what this is about. Not taking positions automatically, but saying, let's try to figure out what this is about. And surely Captain America, reading this thing, ought to have some input line by line. I really would have liked to see that, but that turns into a classroom and not a movie.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm nursing an electromagnetic headache. That's what's going on, Cap. It's just pain. It's discomfort. Who's putting coffee grounds in the disposal? Am I running bed and breakfast for biker gang?
So Tony gets up and he sort of deflects, right? He takes the attention off this bigger issue for a moment, and he's letting his frustration out on little things. But also in there, and we're going to see in a minute here, right? When Steve says he's already made up his mind, he rolls his eyes and says, "Oh, you know me so well."
Right.
And then he gets up here and he basically says, "No, I just got a headache, from what we were just doing. That's it. I'm just in discomfort." But what we're going to see is he actually, in a couple of seconds here, says there is no decision-making process, right? So he's already made up his mind. And again, it comes back to that question, right? How much of this has he read? How much of it does he understand, before taking a position on something? Or how much of it just has to do with the next part of the clip we're going to watch?
Well, I think the latter, because we know, those who've watched the beginning of this film know that, among other things, the responsibility for the carnage has fallen onto Stark as a person in the public more than the rest. Captain America he's Captain America kind of glow still. Not completely, but some. Stark has the eccentric, rich, sarcastic, smarmy billionaire, former weapons maker.
Yeah, there's
so
a lot
he's going to feel that weight.
Yeah, there's a lot of context and history to this that's playing into it. Like you said, I mean, Stark was essentially reviled before he was Iron Man for being, a weapons trader, right? And like you said, Captain America, he almost has this shroud around him, not only because he was gone for 80 years or whatever. So again, there's that feeling of the bygone era, the good old days, this sort of thing,
Yes.
When there was ethical questions of their own in the creation of,
but very different context. And Captain America also, if we think of that fusion of the past and the present in his life, almost instantaneous. Tony Stark's dad was the one who created Captain America. So he's a guy who created a superhero to go out and do things that other people couldn't do. He's got to have that in his head when he's talking to the kid star.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
How can you be essentially 80 or 90 years old, whatever Cap is, even though you look like you're 30 something, and not look at somebody else and think of them as young?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's Charles Spencer, by the way. He's a great kid. Computer engineering degree, 3.6 GPA. Had a floor-level gig, an Intel plan for the fall. But first, he wanted to put a few miles on his soul before he parked it behind a desk, see the world, maybe be of service. Charlie didn't want to go to Vegas or Fort Lauderdale, which is what I would do. He didn't go to Paris or Amsterdam. Sounds fun. He decided to spend his summer building sustainable housing for the poor, guess where? Sokovia. He wanted to make a difference, I suppose. I mean, we won't know because we dropped the building on him while we were kicking ass.
So this is a really interesting philosophical thing, right? Because up until this point, they've been talking about it in either an abstract way or in how it affects them as a group. Tony brings in a different element where now he's talking about how it affects somebody who they died, who you didn't see on film, you know.
No.
You didn't. None of this happened. This is just all stuff that happens in the background. Like I said, this has happened in every Avengers fight scene, right? But it's not the focal point.
Surely there was death and a lot of hospitalization by people who had things falling on them because the Avengers were battling these creatures in New York, yes. And interestingly, Stark wouldn't have given this a thought until the mother of this young man earlier in the movie approaches him, desperately approaches him. So it's not like he arrived at that thinking about it himself. He didn't. He's always thinking the big picture. She had to do that, which triggered something, which was a causality of its own. So yeah, I think it was brilliant to put this in.
And it raises the question, right? So, and that's why reality is so much more complicated than cinema, right? Is because he could have arrived at this a different way too, which would have been very likely to happen in a real scenario, right? Let's say the Avengers are protecting New York City, right, from the alien invasion.
Yeah.
Well, what about if you see a taxi cab getting thrown at a mother and her kid, and the Hulk or Tony or name your superhero dives in and catches the taxi? They're a second or two too late, right? Even something that would be enough, right? If for a real person to start thinking, wait, what am I doing here?
Exactly.
Like, who am I to be, to be thinking?
You said when we talked about the other piece with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke, I loved this. You pointed out, in any given day, if I'd been attacked and knocked out, that would have been enough for one day. But then we've got all these other things going on in the same day, and that's partly what this is evocative of, which is the complexity of modern life. No, we're not throwing cars around, we're not saving, those kind of things, but yet we don't just get to process one thing before we go on to the next thing. None of us does. At work, you've got things flying at you all the time. As a grandfather, and I'm trying to do other kinds of things. We all have this. It's not multitasking. It's an overused word, and it doesn't really mean much to me anymore. It's been because it's overwrought. We are beset by many things simultaneously, and we have either to find our way through them the best that we can as human beings, or else we get paralyzed.
Yeah, we talked about it in the past. I can't remember what episode it was on the podcast, but we talked about essentially how in novels or movies or these sorts of things, you see a Campbellian story arc. But in real life, all of us have several Campbellian story arcs.
At various,
right?
various places.
So, yes, I'm definitely the hero in many of my stories. But in some stories, I'm the villain. In some stories, I'm the wise guiding figure. In some stories, I'm, the friendly rogue, that's in, there's...
Yes.
In all of these, that's the way life is, right? It's not this clear-cut, black and white, story arc, but all of us have several stories going on in which we're playing multiple parts. And
the rhetoric of what he says, of what Stark says in this, when he uses the word serve, no, he wanted to serve. Well, that's what the Avengers are trying to do too, but how does one best serve is the implication of that little, the word doesn't keep getting used in the dialogue, but they planted it there.
Yeah, and we see in the later Iron Man movies, right, that Tony is in the throes of PTSD right now, right? And so that idea, and you can even sort of see it here. I'm certain he's thinking about, how his service, involves buildings being dropped on people and cities being leveled and a loss of life and these technological errors that create supervillains. Whereas this kid was just going to build sustainable housing, right? Yeah. Find places for people to live, find food for them to eat, create a better life for people. One is very constructive and one's destructive. And
but he's saying this is as important as what we are doing. That's what I liked about it.
Right, exactly.
So it's not superheroes as gods, not superheroes as better than everybody else. Superheroes as complicated and see, you just said this and brings up something else I hadn't thought about before. So Sam, when we first encounter him, is somebody who works with soldiers with PTSD. And this is how he starts his conversation with Cap. Later in the second Infinity War movie, Captain America is the guy who's sitting with a support group. We never get the background on how that happens, but here he is talking to ordinary people, trying to help them figure out what happened after this catastrophe. So this scene, and the one in the previous Captain America movie, no, it's not the previous. Is it this one? This is one where he meets Sam. Yeah, I guess it's it's the one with
the Winter Soldier.
The Winter Soldier, that was it, and so. They launched this rippling, quiet discussion that, as you say, you can miss it in all the mayhem. You can just go and eat the popcorn up. I love popcorn, but you can go and eat the popcorn up and say, well, it was a good movie, wasn't it? Yeah, what was good about it? Well, it was a lot of fun. Or you can say, look at all the stuff that's in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that evolution right there, from Captain America being in a support group to leading a support group, right? And the evolution of his character there, and versus the evolution of Tony's character, right? In Iron Man, coming out real bombastic, real, carefree, and then sort of through his experiences devolving into this, really anxious,
angry person.
Right. Yeah, there's some character growth there.
There's no decision-making process here. We need to be put in check. Whatever form that takes, I'm game. If we can't accept limitations, we're boundaryless, we're no better than the bad guys.
What Vision's eyes did in that?
No, I missed it.
Vision, listening to Stark say that, you can see a sadness. We need to be put in check. His eyes are going down, because that's not what he was saying. Stark is being overwrought and authoritarian. Vision is saying oversight. Stark is saying we need to be put in check. Put in check sounds a lot more stern and rigid than oversight.
Yeah, and I had that exact same reaction. I didn't see Vision, but I had that same reaction when I was watching the clip, preparing for the show. There's something about that phrase, right? As soon as he says "be put in check," that simple phrase, that little bit of language, is what's going to essentially tear the group apart. It's what's going to be divisive.
By saying there is no decision-making process, therefore I'm not inviting discussion, which is something reflective in our own culture now. And essentially what Stark is really saying, and isn't facing it himself, is I need to be put in check. I created Ultron. I was going to make a decision for the whole planet to have this iron force that would keep Thanos-like creatures away. He didn't consult any of the rest of them about that. There was no decision-making process. He co-opted Banner and said, let's make this thing.
Right. So it's sort of a projection on himself, but the way it's coming across is Steve is now, he's seeing that like it's reaffirming his assumptions about Tony, right?
Yeah.
Oh, there's no decision-making process, you know, we need to be put in check. Yeah, Tony already had his mind made up. He already, and then, you know, that's going to harden him against
Of
hearing
course.
the other side of the argument.
Yeah.
Tony, if someone dies on your watch, you don't give up.
Who said we're giving up?
We are for not taking responsibility for our actions. This document just shifts the blame.
So there we go. Steve, he does have an attempt at conversation here with Tony, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, he, even with a less aggressive a less aggressive tone, some of the language is still demonstrating that he's stick in one position, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
he's considering the loss of autonomy giving up, right? And giving up is strong language, right? You hear that? I mean, it's essentially, you know, what do you think that that's evoking in Tony? Probably, it's almost essentially calling him a coward, right? Saying, oh, you know, you're planning on giving up,
Yeah.
and you know, his view is that we're already taking responsibility for our actions. The Accord is just shifting the blame. Do you think that's true?
I think it could be, because if you're going to have Secretary Ross and whatever council internationally says where these people go and what they do, then they are sanctioning actions, and therefore that would imply that the committee or whatever it is saying, okay, we gave our blessing to this, so we have to own it together. But of course, a committee can't own something the way an individual can.
Yeah, and I think that might be what Steve is saying, right? When he says, well, we're already taking responsibility for our actions. Well, how? How are you taking responsibility for your actions? So what is the if having the oversight is just shifting the blame, then I think what Steve is saying is we're taking responsibility for the actions morally.
By doing what we're doing right now, for Steve, this is enough. For Steve, this is this conversation. We have to not just leap. We have to be able to be independent, to be able to say, look, there's a problem here. This committee isn't going to get to this problem for months. They may not even see the problem, may not acknowledge the problem, but we know this supervillain is over here doing this. We need to have a discussion about what we do. I think that's what he's implying, but then we're going to go out and do it. Also, you know, we have to keep in mind that in the story arc, Steve, Captain America, has just come off an experience wherein the very organization that helped revive him, SHIELD, for which he was working, betrayed him, hadn't told him what was going on, were using him, had co-opted him. And that's got to be in his head too. No, I'm not going to do that again.
Yeah. And so, you know, it's a beautiful example of what's been going on in the past movies, right? Because like you said, Tony was going out to do this Iron Force thing. He's taken all of this kind of individual initiative with no oversight, and it seems like at every turn his plans were either foiled or actually turned into something bad against him. And so what he's saying is, listen, we can't trust individual responsibility. Somebody has to be there that's unbiased, that's going to say this is something we need to do. Whereas Steve is saying, listen, you know, if we create this sort of thing, like you said, Hydra was running SHIELD, right? Look at they essentially had oversight, you know. They were the ones that brought us together, and they were the bad guys, you know. So it is an interesting paradox.
It's a paradox, yeah.
Steve, that is dangerously arrogant. This is the United Nations we're talking about. It's not the World Security Council. It's not SHIELD. It's not Hydra.
No, but it...
So right there again, we have Colonel Rhodes. So very high-ranking military member, part of a structured organization, structured government organization.
Mm-hmm.
You know, somebody who, you know, we can assume his experience with the military has been a positive one, right? I mean, look at him. He's War Machine, right? He flew fighter jets. He did these things. He progressed through the ranks. He did this. And, you know, what he's saying is, listen, you know, if you're saying that this individual responsibility is enough, Like, that's pretty arrogant because, you know, any of these other organizations have committees of people deciding what's good. But this isn't just another organization. This is 117 countries saying that this needs to happen.
And he's differentiating the United Nations from SHIELD, one organ like CIA or FBI or something, or Hydra or some evil group. Yeah.
What are the chances that 117 countries are all, you know, in league with the bad guys? Probably not. Probably not great.
By people with agendas, and agendas change.
That's good. That's why I'm here. When I realized what my weapons were capable of in the wrong hands, I shut it down, stopped manufacturing.
So again, right here we go. There's more distrust, right? Steve is saying that, you know, if we hand over power to people, people have agendas, right?
Yeah.
Which is an interesting take, right? Because again, a lot of the discussion that's happened so far is that attempt to break through the current thought paradigm, to introduce the idea that maybe we have biases, maybe we have blind spots. Steve still doesn't seem to be accepting that.
No, Steve's we're the super guys, and we have to maintain that oversight ourselves. We have to think hard morally. We have to have the right. Steve is the duty guy. Steve is the deontological fellow. Your duty is to do this if you have the power to do it. Your duty is to do the moral thing with the power that you have. And if it goes south, you tried, but the point is it's right because it was your duty to do so. And Stark is the consequentialist. Yeah, we were trying to do the right thing, but it didn't turn out right. So it was wrong.
Yeah. And again, you know, bring up Stark's whole history, right? He's saying, yeah, having people with agendas is good because they showed me that something was wrong, and I shut it down, right? But there's a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a little overly simplistic. I shut it down, but then I built something else, and then we all had to shut it down, and that's what led to this in the first.
Right.
Chose to do that. If we sign this, we surrender our right to choose.
Yeah, I like that.
But if this panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go and they don't let us? We may not be perfect, but the safest hands are still our own.
If we don't do this now,
It's going to be done to us later.
There's a lot in that little clip there, but you know, and especially at the beginning of it, you know, Steve talking about forfeiting the right to choose and do all this different stuff, which, you know, is something that people are always struggling with, right? Anytime there's an intrinsic struggle, right, between government and individualism, right? And I think that's always been the case ever since the beginning of time, right? Whatever the first government organization was, I'm sure somebody said, hey, listen, we should invent this rule in order to help the survival of the group. And somebody said, no, like you can't limit my behavior in that way, right? And of course, that's just been the trope of modern governments for ever since. Well, it goes back before the United States, you know, probably to the Magna Carta, really.
At least.
At least the past 800 years, that's been the discussion, right? Is where do you draw the line on what is the best for society and how much individual freedom and liberty people should have? And, you know, I'm sure that there's some people out there that say, well, the government should never tell somebody what to do. And, you know, well, that makes you an anarchist, right? And then you can just go and kill people and take things for your own and amass your own stuff, right? And that's essentially the world can't continue to turn if you operate that way. And then there's other people who say, well, this, you know, the second that, you know, we hand things over, then, you know, it's 1984, right? They're gonna start limiting the language we can use. And they're gonna start telling us what jobs we can work and all this other thing.
When we know that the reality, and yes, I use the word reality, even though we don't share it sometimes in this culture, the reality of things is that it's going to be some of both. That the utility of doing what's good for the many as opposed to the few, which is sort of being hinted at in here too in a very odd way, is what leads to the the best result for the most wide range of people. That goes back to the initial utilitarian view. And if you don't want to do something because you don't want to, because you have the choice, but for the grand majority of every kind of people, it's the best choice, well, then utilitarians would say, come on, get on board, or just go have a coffee and settle down.
Yeah.
You know, so.
And that raises, you know, like it's sort of this parallel again, this mirror image of what we were talking about before, where, you know, yeah, you watch a film and there's one Campbellian story arc, whereas a life has many. It's sort of the same thing with philosophy and moral codes, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's nobody that's strictly a deontologist or a consequentialist or a utilitarian. In real life, you know, you look at a scenario and then you're weighing the balance between these sorts of things, right? And you're trying to come up with what makes sense. And that is the central question of this issue is, who's making that judgment of what makes sense? Who's saying this is the correct amount of deontology, consequentialism, and utilitarianism? Can I trust myself to make that choice? Can I trust this group of people that I consider moral to make this choice? Or do we need an outside group to make that choice?
Exactly. That's why that's the anchoring point for all of this. And it exudes this scene, the very fact that you must weigh. To just leap in and say there's no discussion doesn't lead in at anything. I'm right and you're wrong, so just go with me. No, not good enough. We have to weigh things.
That won't be pretty.
You're saying they'll come for me.
We would protect you.
Maybe Tony's right. If we have one hand on the wheel, we can still steer. If we take it off...
Aren't you the same woman who told the government to kiss her ass a few years ago?
I'm reading the terrain. We have made some very public mistakes. We need to win their trust back.
Focus up.
So then here's another perspective, right? Natasha is not really examining it from a moral standpoint like the rest of them, which makes sense given her background. But she's saying, listen, if we sign the Accords, if we go along with this, at least we can continue to protect people and do what we're doing. If we choose not to abide by the Accords, she's saying, I know where this is going, which is essentially we're all going to be scattered to the wind and we're not going to be able to effectively unite and combat a threat, which is sort of what happens. Come Infinity War. So another interesting point, and again, it's coming from a standpoint that isn't moralistic, and it doesn't have to do with that bigger question, but it still is an important philosophical examination of their situation.
Absolutely.
So that pretty much concludes the scene. There's a witty take here at the end from Tony.
Sorry, did I just mishear you, or did you agree with me?
Oh, I want to take it back.
No, you can't retract it. Thank you.
So as you see, there's some group dynamics in there, right? I think that what that tells us is on a regular basis, they probably have conflicts and discussions like this, and there's probably pretty clear party lines that are drawn and who takes what sides. And Natasha and Tony probably aren't on similar sides, which again, given their different backgrounds, who they worked with, the consequences of their actions, it sort of makes sense that they'd have some different views.
Of course,
yeah. So this was a fun discussion. I think there's a lot there. I think that we got to a lot of it. There were some things where I know that I had it before the show, and I thought this would be a good thing to bring up, and I forgot. So,
there's always more to bring up.
That's the nature of the podcast. Is I'm sure that 2 or 3 or 4 episodes down the road, we'll be talking about something, and I'll think, oh, that was it, and then we'll bring it back
to this.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
But until next time, keep pondering.